November 6th, 1980. Baltimore, Maryland. Nancy Snow, a 44-year-old political fundraiser for the Republican National Committee, is picked up from a hotel by Paul Collins, the house sitter at her apartment in Annapolis, but she soon vanishes without a trace. Collins claims that Nancy left on an impromptu trip to Florida with a man named Captain J so she could spend several weeks sailing on a yacht through the Caribbean, but her family has a hard time believing the story. Nearly 1 year later, after being questioned by police, Collins flees to the Bahamas, but there is no evidence to implicate him in Nancy's disappearance, and she continues to remain a missing person. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a unique missing persons case to cover, the 1980 disappearance of Nancy Snow. And if that wasn't enough, The Trail Went Cold is going political this week. Okay, not really, but the victim in today's story was a congressional fundraiser for the Republican National Committee who just happened to go missing 2 days after Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. However, it seems unlikely that politics played any role in Nancy's disappearance, and the timing is nothing more than a coincidence. After several months of exhausting work on the campaign trail, Nancy told everyone she was planning to spend some time unwinding at her apartment in Annapolis, Maryland, but wound up vanishing without a trace and broke off all contact with her 3 daughters. The last known person to see Nancy alive was Paul Collins, who was the temporary house sitter at her apartment whenever Nancy was on the road. Collins claimed that almost immediately after they arrived in Annapolis, Nancy went to a local bar and met a man known only as Captain J, who offered to drive Nancy to Florida so that she could crew a yacht he was planning to deliver to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Nancy supposedly told Collins that she would return home by Christmas, but she never did, and her daughters did not believe she would have left on an impromptu sailing trip with someone she did not know without even telling them about it. Suspicion towards Collins grew once it turned out he was using Nancy's chequebook in her absence, and the police pressure on him became so great that he eventually decided to skip the country and take off to the Bahamas. While Collins continues to remain a person of interest in Nancy's disappearance, there has never been enough evidence to charge him with a crime. Given Nancy's prominent position as a congressional fundraiser, there has always been a surprising lack of media coverage of her disappearance outside of the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area. But this is definitely an odd mystery, so on this episode, we're going to explore whether Nancy really did leave on a trip with a mysterious figure named Captain J, or if she went missing for entirely different reasons. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Nancy Snow. Our story begins in 1980, and our central figure is 44-year-old Nancy Marlene Snow. Originally born in California, Nancy is known for being a very active socialite who has traveled extensively around the world. She has previously resided in Brazil and West Germany, and speaks no less than 7 different languages. While living in California, Nancy got married and had 3 daughters named Stacy, Justine, and Kimberly, and worked as a talk show host at KMST-TV in Monterey. Nancy's marriage would end in divorce, and while her ex-husband got custody of their daughters and they remained with him in California, Nancy continued to stay in frequent contact with her children and maintain close relationships with them. At this particular point in time, Nancy has spent the past 2 years residing at a colonial-style apartment in Annapolis, Maryland, but since she is employed as a coordinator for the Republican National Committee, and 1980 is an election year, she is constantly away on the road. Nancy was assigned to be a congressional fundraiser for Gene McNary, Missouri's Republican nominee for United States Senator, so she spends a good chunk of her time at his campaign headquarters in St. Louis. Well, on November the 4th, Election Day finally arrived, and as many of you probably know, Republican candidate Ronald Reagan wound up defeating incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter in a landslide victory, and would soon begin serving his first of 2 terms in the White House as President of the United States. However, in spite of Nancy's hard work, Gene McNary would not get to celebrate a similar victory, as he was defeated in a close race by Thomas Eagleton, the incumbent Democratic Senator of Missouri. While the loss was a disappointing one, Nancy told her daughters that she was exhausted from working on the campaign trail for several months, so she was looking forward to taking some time off and spending the next few weeks relaxing in Annapolis. But before she returned home, Nancy flew from St. Louis to Baltimore on November the 5th in order to attend a private party being held by a man named Bob Goodman. When the party ended, Nancy spent the night at a hotel, and on the morning of November the 6th, she went out to breakfast with Bob as they had started dating each other during the campaign. After breakfast, Nancy waited inside Bob's car for her ride to arrive. Nancy was scheduled to be picked up by Paul Thomas Collins III, who worked as a chimney sweep, but he had also been hired by Nancy to be the temporary house sitter and caretaker for her apartment while she was away on the road. According to Bob Goodman, when Collins arrived, Nancy said goodbye to him and exited his car. She then climbed into Collins' vehicle in order to begin the 25-mile drive from Baltimore to Annapolis, but this would turn out to be the last time Nancy was confirmed to be alive. For the next several days, Nancy's daughters never received any phone calls, letters, and postcards from her, which they found very unusual, since she always consistently stayed in contact with them, even when she was extremely busy. By this point, Nancy's oldest daughter, Stacy, was 20 years old, and had started following in her mother's footsteps by working as a talk show host at KMST-TV in Monterey. She had been planning to visit her mother in Annapolis sometime in November, but never heard from her, and all phone calls to Nancy went unanswered. Stacy eventually received a letter from Bob Goodman, who shared his account about Nancy being picked up at the hotel in Baltimore by Paul Collins. However, Bob shared a detail which didn't make much sense to Stacy, as he claimed that Nancy had told him she was planning to drive to Connecticut with her house sitter the day after she arrived in Annapolis. Stacy found this unusual, as her mother had never mentioned anything about a Connecticut trip with her, and she was under the impression that Nancy was content to unwind in Annapolis for a few weeks after several months of constant travel. Concern grew in late November when Nancy's middle daughter, Justine, turned 16 years old. During their last phone conversation together, Nancy had asked Justine what she wanted for her birthday and told her that she was looking forward to seeing her again at Christmas. But when Justine's birthday arrived, Nancy failed to contact her or send her any gifts, which was very uncharacteristic. Nancy's family got in touch with Paul Collins, who took them by complete surprise when he informed them that she had left on an impromptu trip. According to Collins, the night after they arrived in Annapolis, Nancy went out for a drink at a local bar called McGarvey's. During the early morning hours of November the 8th, Collins claimed that Nancy woke him up to say that she had met a boat captain at the bar whom she only referred to as Captain J. Captain J apparently owned a yacht chartering business and was about to drive to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where he would pick up a 45-foot ketch, which is a 2-masted sailboat, and deliver it to a client in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Nancy said that Captain J had just hired her to help him crew the ketch, so she told Collins that she was now planning to accompany Captain J to Fort Lauderdale and sail through the Caribbean with him on his charter. She then proceeded to pack a bag and grab $1,000 in cash, and told Collins that she hoped to arrive in the Virgin Islands and then return home by Christmas. Collins then said that he walked Nancy down the street to an intersection where a white van picked her up, but after she left, he never saw or heard from her again. While it was true that Nancy did have a devout interest in yachting and had expressed a desire to get out of the high-stress world of politics and eventually gain enough experience with crewing boats to purchase her own yacht, obtain a captain's license, and start her own chartering business. In fact, there were reports of Nancy having previously visited boatyards and taverns in Annapolis in order to inquire about performing work on any incoming boats which required crew members. However, given what a devoted and responsible mother Nancy was, her daughters had a hard time believing that she would have left on a yachting trip with some guy she just met without telling them, especially since she had become exhausted by her campaigning and was looking forward to a rest. Furthermore, she never bothered to leave a note for her daughters to explain what she was doing or leave any contact information in case they needed to reach her. Collins also claimed that he never actually saw the mysterious Captain J when he picked Nancy up, so he had no idea what the guy looked like, and Collins said he did not get the make or license number of Captain J's van or the name of his boat. Stacy eventually traveled to Baltimore to temporarily move into her mother's apartment so she could perform her own independent investigation. While there, she noticed that Nancy had left behind a number of important items she would have ordinarily taken with her on a lengthy trip, including her boat shoes, makeup, and jewelry. Even though Nancy had supposedly told Collins she would return home by Christmas, she never did and made no attempt to contact her family. Finally, in January of 1981, after not hearing from her mother for 2 months, Stacy convinced Collins to accompany her on a trip to Fort Lauderdale in order to search for her. They flashed Nancy's picture at a number of motels in the area, but had no luck finding her. Stacy then officially filed a missing persons report, and Nancy's story would receive its first media coverage when the Baltimore Sun published an extensive article about her case on April the 30th. Collins agreed to be interviewed for the article and complained that Nancy's disappearance had caused him to accumulate over $2,000 in debts, not only from his trip to Florida, but from his continued house-sitting duties. Nancy's rent was going unpaid in her absence, and her apartment was also burglarized, so the stress of the whole situation prompted Collins to check into an ulcer clinic in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There were a number of reported eyewitness sightings of Nancy from people who knew her personally, including one friend that recalled having seen her in the company of an older man at a casino in the Virgin Islands, and another friend who was certain they had seen Nancy driving through Baltimore in a green BMW. However, no conclusive evidence could be found to indicate that Nancy ever made it to Fort Lauderdale, and in fact, investigators had a hard time confirming Nancy's whereabouts after Collins picked her up in Baltimore on November the 6th. Even though Collins had publicly stated that Nancy's disappearance had caused him to go into debt, it turned out that he had actually been using her checkbook and likely forged her signature for about 6 months after she went missing. Collins used Nancy's checkbook in order to pay bills and write a number of checks to himself, and in total, he spent approximately $10,000 of her money. When confronted about this, Collins maintained that right before she left, Nancy had given him permission to use the checkbook to pay expenses while she was gone, but her family found it unlikely that she would have given someone that much free rein with her money. Nancy also owned a turquoise Volkswagen convertible, and while Collins told her daughters that he was keeping it in storage during her absence, a number of witnesses reported seeing Collins driving the convertible around town after Nancy disappeared. In addition, Collins reportedly gave away a number of Nancy's belongings and personal papers, even though no one could be 100% certain if she would ever return. These discrepancies were troubling enough that Collins was formally questioned about Nancy's disappearance in October of 1981, but he continued to share the same story and maintained that Nancy had left with an individual named Captain J, even though investigators were unable to confirm that this man actually existed. While there was no direct evidence of a crime, the authorities were concerned that Nancy had become the victim of foul play and were considering the possibility of a grand jury investigation. However, before this could take place, Collins suddenly fled the country and took off to the Bahamas. When he left, Collins reportedly stole $200 in cash, some magnetic signs, and a set of chimney sweeping equipment from his employer, so an arrest warrant was issued for him on the charge of misdemeanor theft. The full circumstances of what happened are unclear, but it sounds like Collins was served with the arrest warrant in August of 1982 before he was released on bond, and the theft case was closed by the end of the year. At some point, Collins left the Bahamas and permanently moved back to Maryland. As for Nancy, there would be no activity on her Social Security number or her credit cards after November of 1980, and even though she collected on an inheritance shortly before she went missing, none of the money in her bank account was ever touched. As a result, Nancy's family had her declared legally dead in 1985. The case would fade from the spotlight for the next 2 decades, but there would be renewed interest in 2005 as Nancy's story was featured in a number of publications, including the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, and the Annapolis-based newspaper, the Capital Gazette. It was confirmed that the Anne Arundel County State's Attorney's Office were taking a fresh look at the case, and the lead investigator stated that Paul Collins, quote-unquote, might be considered a person of interest. However, Collins declined to speak to the media about the case and simply referred them to his attorney. As part of the new investigation, a number of people were re-interviewed, and while details are vague, it was reported that the authorities were hoping to speak with a man known only as Sam or Sammy, who is believed to have been a boyfriend of Nancy's at the time she went missing and may have worked as a shoe salesman. Nancy's daughter Justine provided a sample of her DNA in the event that any unidentified remains were found, and a comparison needed to be made in order to determine if they belonged to her mother. In addition, Nancy's family announced that they were offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of her remains and the conviction of her killer. In June of 2010, the Washington Examiner reported that after declining to be interviewed by investigators for years, Collins agreed to speak with the Anne Arundel County State's Attorney's Office once prosecutors offered him limited immunity, which meant that nothing Collins said could be used against him. On the basis of what Collins told them, investigators said they were now looking for a 55-foot sailboat known as the Cotton Blossom, which had been docked at the Petrini shipyard in Annapolis in 1980. While they had been attempting to track down the yacht through Coast Guard vessel records, the authorities had no luck finding it, as there were apparently a lot of boats out there named the Cotton Blossom. However, they did confirm that it, quote-unquote, might be a key to finding Nancy's killer. It was also revealed that investigators had interviewed a number of longtime and former employees of McGarvey's, the bar where Nancy supposedly met Captain J, but none of them recalled ever seeing an individual there by that name. Unfortunately, there do not appear to have been any new developments this past decade, and after more than 40 years, Nancy Snow continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So from what I've read about Nancy Snow, she sounds like someone who packed an awful lot into the 44 years of life that she lived on Earth. Like I mentioned earlier, before she became a congressional fundraiser for the Republican National Committee, she had been a TV talk show host, lived in at least 2 other foreign countries, and learned 7 different languages. We don't really have any details about why Nancy's marriage came to an end, but even though her ex-husband retained primary custody of their 3 daughters, and Nancy was an incredibly busy person who constantly traveled, she still managed to remain a very devoted mother who did everything she could to maintain close relationships with her children. I'm sure anyone who has ever worked on a political campaign during an election year will tell you that it completely consumes your life, so I can only imagine how hectic Nancy's schedule was, yet she still made it a point to find time to call and write her daughters at every available opportunity. Now, on one hand, since Nancy was known for having an adventurous spirit and had been hoping to gain experience crewing boats, it might not have seemed completely out of the realm of possibility that she would decide to make a spontaneous trip to Florida in order to serve as a crew member on a ketch traveling through the Caribbean. But on the other hand, the timing of this whole endeavor didn't really fit, since Nancy had just completed several months of exhausting work on the campaign trail, so she was looking forward to taking some time to relax. And most suspiciously, she never even bothered to inform her children about this trip, or make any further contact with them, which was very out of character, and immediately caused them to fear that she was no longer alive. So was Nancy harmed by the mysterious figure known only as Captain J? Or were Captain J and this Caribbean yachting trip nothing more than complete fabrications by the person who really harmed Nancy, Paul Thomas Collins III? Well, like I mentioned earlier, given that Nancy worked for the Republican National Committee and had just played a major role in a congressional campaign for the 1980 U.S. Senate elections, there seemed to be a surprising lack of media coverage about her case. Her disappearance was first reported in the Baltimore Sun on April 30th, 1981, nearly 6 full months after Nancy was last seen, though I'm sure this had a lot to do with the lengthy delay before an official missing persons investigation was launched. But even so, I cannot find much coverage of the case after that until the investigation was reopened during the mid-2000s. However, it's interesting to compare the modern-day coverage to the reporting from 1981. Reading that aforementioned Baltimore Sun article, you get the impression that the authorities initially believed Paul Collins' story that Nancy had left on a trip with a guy named Captain J. A number of different theories were explored, such as the possibility that Nancy really did set sail on a ketch through the Caribbean until the boat wound up sinking in a tropical storm. There was also fear that Captain J may have killed Nancy on the vessel and dumped her body into the ocean, or that she was murdered by him before they even made it to Fort Lauderdale. If Nancy's family or the authorities had any inclination at the time to believe that Collins' story was completely bogus, they did not say so publicly. After all, I'm not sure that Nancy's daughter Stacy would have been comfortable taking a trip to Florida with Collins if she suspected he was a murderer. I'm guessing that when the Baltimore Sun article was originally published, no one had yet found out that Collins was using Nancy's chequebook and profiting financially from her absence. And that's all the more ironic, considering that Collins used that article as an opportunity to bitch and complain about the fact that Nancy's disappearance had supposedly caused him to go into debt. You have to wonder if that's a complete lie, or if Collins only started using the chequebook because he went into debt. It's interesting how Collins checked into an ulcer clinic during that time period due to stress, but in retrospect, you have to wonder if it was financial stress or anxiety about the fact that law enforcement was now investigating a potential homicide which he had committed. Of course, by the end of 1981, the authorities had become suspicious of Collins and were considering a grand jury investigation, so Collins' stress became so great that he decided to skip the country and take off to the Bahamas. Obviously, since Nancy was fundraising on a congressional campaign for a senatorial candidate from Missouri, she was going to be on the road a lot in 1980 and was unable to spend much time at her apartment in Annapolis. It definitely makes sense that she would want to hire a temporary house sitter to watch over her place while she was gone, but we really don't know all that much about Paul Collins' background or why Nancy decided to hire him. Did Collins answer an ad she put out for the position, or did they already have a prior relationship? Whatever the case, I find it fascinating that Collins' main job was working as a chimney sweep, since that's an occupation I always associate with Mary Poppins. The fact that Collins went to the trouble of stealing chimney sweeping equipment from his employer when he fled to the Bahamas is one of the stranger details I've ever read in a missing persons case. Was he planning to open up his own chimney sweeping business while he was hiding out? There are court documents online which show that Collins was served with an arrest warrant for misdemeanor theft in August of 1982, though it's unclear if he actually served any jail time for this. It seems obvious that Collins' brash decision to flee the country was likely due to the fact that he was being looked at as a person of interest in Nancy's disappearance, though he did ultimately decide to return to Maryland. So this is definitely not the first unsolved cold case I've seen in which a missing victim's house sitter/caretaker came under suspicion. Just 3 years before Nancy disappeared, Helen Brock, the 65-year-old multimillionaire heiress of the E.J. Brock & Sons Candy Company, vanished without a trace, supposedly after returning to her mansion in Glenview, Illinois, from a trip to Minnesota. I may cover this case on a future episode of The Trail Went Cold, so I won't go into too many details, but long story short, Brock's houseman/chauffeur, Jack Matlick, would come under suspicion, and you can definitely see a number of parallels to the situation with Nancy Snow and Paul Collins. Matlick claimed that a few days after Brock returned home, he drove her to O'Hare International Airport so that she could catch a flight for a trip she had planned to Florida, but after he dropped her off, Matlick said he never saw her again. But of course, investigators never found any evidence that Brock ever traveled to Florida. Sound familiar? If that wasn't enough, Matlick also claimed that before she left, Brock signed $13,000 worth of checks for him, though it seemed obvious that her signature had been forged. When confronted about this, Matlick changed his story and now claimed that he signed the checks on Brock's behalf because she had injured her hand. After Brock went missing, Matlick also destroyed her personal diaries, which sounds a bit similar to how Collins gave away a number of Nancy's private papers after she disappeared. In the end, Matlick was never charged with anything in connection to Brock's disappearance, but even though he looked incredibly suspicious, this story is so convoluted that I can't say with 100% certainty that Matlick was single-handedly responsible for what happened. But theoretically, since the case got a ton of mainstream media coverage by 1980, I have to wonder if Collins heard about it and might have even used it as inspiration when he fabricated a cover story about Nancy traveling to Florida and then decided to use her checkbook in her absence. It is a bit surprising that Collins was never charged with anything in relation to the checkbook, since it seems likely that he forged Nancy's signature. But I guess investigators could technically not disprove the idea that Nancy signed the checks before she left and gave Collins permission to use them, even though it sounds like it was very uncharacteristic for her to trust someone that much with her financial affairs. But let's start at the very beginning and figure out the exact timeline of when Nancy went missing. We know that after the elections came to an end, Nancy traveled from St. Louis to Baltimore on the evening of November the 5th in order to attend a private party hosted by a man named Bob Goodman. After spending the night at a hotel, Nancy had breakfast with Bob before she was picked up by Collins, and officially, this is the last time she was confirmed to be alive. It's been reported that Nancy had started dating Bob during the campaign, though there isn't any information about what kind of relationship they had, or if Nancy was hoping to turn it into a serious long-term thing. While there's nothing to indicate that Bob was involved in Nancy's disappearance or untruthful about anything, he did claim that Nancy told him that she was planning to drive to Connecticut with her house sitter, a detail she never shared with her daughters and which they found incredibly odd. Again, I'm sure Bob isn't lying, and it's possible that he may have simply misremembered or misunderstood something that Nancy said to him, but as far as her daughters were concerned, Nancy was going to spend the next several weeks unwinding in Annapolis, and she never mentioned anything about a side trip to Connecticut, which would have been a 5-hour drive away. And she also apparently said she was going there with Collins, who never mentioned anything about Connecticut in his story. If Nancy really was planning to go there, I have no idea what the purpose of this trip would have been, but if Collins went with her, and he's the guilty party, he could have used this as an opportunity to kill Nancy, and perhaps her remains are somewhere in Connecticut. The fact of the matter is that even though Collins claimed he drove Nancy back to Annapolis and she spent one night there before leaving during the early morning hours of November the 8th, we really don't have any concrete evidence or independent eyewitness sightings to confirm that Nancy ever made it to Annapolis to begin with. So for all we know, something could have happened to her almost immediately after she left Baltimore. As an aside, other than Bob Goodman, there was another witness who recalled seeing Nancy climb into a car when she was picked up in Baltimore, but even though a specific description could not be provided of the vehicle, the witness was apparently certain that it was not a turquoise Volkswagen convertible. As you recall, Nancy owned a vehicle like that which she kept in storage whenever she wasn't in Annapolis, yet Collins was seen driving it around the area after Nancy went missing. I think the fact that Collins arrived in Baltimore to pick up Nancy in another vehicle besides the Volkswagen convertible goes against the idea that she had ever given him permission to drive it. So to recap, Collins' story is that the night after she arrived in Annapolis, Nancy went out to a local bar called McGarvey's and met a man named Captain J, who somehow convinced her to tag along with him while he drove to Fort Lauderdale, where she would crew his boat while they sailed through the Caribbean in order to deliver it to someone in the Virgin Islands. After Nancy packed some belongings, Collins then escorted her down the street, where she was picked up in a white van, but Collins never actually saw Captain J or got his contact information or any details about his boat. From what I gathered about the investigation, the authorities have never been able to find anyone who could corroborate that Nancy actually went to McGarvey's that night and met Captain J, or that Captain J even existed to begin with. Now, putting aside the fact that Nancy seemed to be exhausted and not in any apparent mood to travel, and also the unlikelihood that she would have taken off like this without informing her daughters, she was also clearly a very bright and intelligent woman. In other words, she does not fit the profile of someone who would agree to leave on a 1-month yachting trip through the Caribbean at the drop of a hat with some stranger she just met in a bar. You would have to be an incredibly naive and trusting person to agree to something like that, and from everything I've read about Nancy's background, she does not come across as very naive and trusting. Of course, there are elements of truth in Collins' story, because it has been established that Nancy wanted to gain experience crewing on boats because she was hoping to buy her own yacht and start a chartering business at some point. I can definitely see Nancy agreeing to participate in the yachting trip, but only after a lot of preparation and background checks to ensure she was setting sail with someone she knew and trusted. And given what a devoted mother she was, I'm sure Nancy would have ensured her daughters were well aware of what was going on before she embarked on something like this. So if Collins completely fabricated the story, he probably used real details he knew about Nancy's background in order to dream up a scenario which he hoped people might believe. And I get the impression that Collins was still using this approach when he was questioned about the case decades later. As you recall, after declining to speak with them for years, Collins agreed to be interviewed by the Anne Arundel County State's Attorney's Office in late 2009. They did offer Collins limited immunity, and were even hoping that this might compel him to lead them to Nancy's remains, though this never occurred. But whatever Collins told them, it prompted the authorities to take a new interest in a boat called the Cotton Blossom, and they were hoping to track it down. However, what I find odd is that the Cotton Blossom was not exactly new information, as it was already mentioned in the Baltimore Sun article about the case, which was published in April of 1981. It was docked at the Petrini shipyard at that time, and the yard's manager, Ed Petrini, even agreed to provide comment for the article and confirmed that in hopes of gaining necessary experience, Nancy had inquired about being taken aboard as a cook on the Cotton Blossom, or even performing some additional work at the shipyard, such as painting boats. And to provide a dose of old-school sexism, Petrini confirmed that he had turned down Nancy's offer and stated, quote, "We didn't want any girls around here with all the rough talk, know what I mean?" End quote. It's unclear who the original owner of the Cotton Blossom was back in 1981, or why Nancy was enamored by that particular boat, but I'm not sure how Collins mentioning it to investigators in 2009 is supposed to be beneficial for them. Remember, his story was that Nancy was going to travel with Captain J to Fort Lauderdale in order to pick up his boat and sail across the Caribbean. The Cotton Blossom was docked in Annapolis at that time, and according to the Baltimore Sun, it was still at Petrini shipyard in April of 1981. So if Collins was telling the truth, and Captain J actually existed, then I'm sure he was not the owner of the Cotton Blossom, and he never took Nancy out on it. I mean, I don't blame investigators for wanting to find the Cotton Blossom and cover all their bases, but it sounds to me like Collins was attempting to share information to mislead them, even though he seemed to be contradicting his original story. Now, if you go to the Web Sleuths forum, you'll find a thread about this case containing a few posts from Nancy's daughter Justine under the username FindNancySnow. From her comments, it seems obvious that Nancy's daughters believe that Paul Collins was responsible for her disappearance. While this detail has never been mentioned by any official media source, Justine claimed that at the time her mother went missing, Collins had been living on a trawler which wound up sinking in 16 feet of water. So of course, she now wonders if Nancy might have been on this boat when it sank, and if her remains are still down there. But if Collins was guilty, you have to wonder what his motive might have been. Well, obviously, the fact that Collins kept using Nancy's checkbook provides a financial motive, and while he only used it to spend around $10,000, people have been killed for a lot less. Perhaps Collins had just become enamored with the idea of house-sitting Nancy's fancy apartment, but since the political campaign was over, and she was now going to be spending more time in Annapolis, perhaps she no longer required Collins' services and was planning to let him go. And if he did not react well to this, then things could have escalated into murder. While there was no direct evidence of foul play, Collins' story about Captain J really does not seem truthful at all, and I seriously doubt this person ever existed. And even if Collins did not kill Nancy, I still believe he is not telling the truth about what actually happened to her. Of course, the big issue with these missing persons cases, in which the victim's absence isn't immediately noticed or reported to the authorities, is that it gives the perpetrator ample time to cover their tracks by disposing of the victim's body and all incriminating evidence. As far as I know, Collins is still alive and living in Maryland, but if he is the guilty party and Nancy's remains cannot be found, it's going to take some pretty strong evidence to charge him with murder and may require someone coming forward with information. All three of Nancy's daughters went on to have families of their own, and have openly talked about having their mother go missing caused them to become more paranoid and protective of their own children as they got older. That kind of trauma never leaves you, particularly when you do not receive any answers about what happened, so I would really love Nancy's family to get some sort of resolution. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Snow, please contact the Anne Arundel County State's Attorney's Office at 410-222-1740. That's 410-222-1740. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 5 years, we have released dozens of exclusive bonus episodes which are currently available in our archives. This past month, I released an episode about the 1995 death of David Chase, which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries and supposedly involved a murder victim returning from the grave in order to provide information about how he was killed. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss the unexplained 2002 death of Jamie Stickle. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we have over 50 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listener who has signed up with us on Patreon this week, Jared B. Thank you so much for your support. Anyway, this coming fall, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcastro at CrimeCon, which is being held from September the 22nd to the 24th at the World Center Marriott in Orlando, Florida. Our podcast has a specialized promo code which can be used to get a special 10% discount on tickets, so in order to do so, please visit crimecon.com and use the special promo code COLD23. That's COLD23. I also wanted to mention that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place from August the 25th to the 27th at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel in Austin, Texas. We've got a specialized promo code which you can use in order to get a 15% discount on tickets to that event, so if you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website at truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use our promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's truecrimepodcastfestival.com, and the promo code is TRAIL. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vincent Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.